Hello everyone, this is Alice at Welldoing, and today I'm talking with Dr. Emma Svanberg, who is a clinical psychologist and the author of Parenting for Humans. You say in the book that one of the hardest things about parenting is that you're faced, whatever stage your child is at, you're faced with the reminders of your own experiences and feelings at that time. And is that the kind of key point as to why you wrote the book as you did, kind of focusing on the parent rather than it being a parenting book?
Yes, absolutely. As you say, I think that what we often do when we talk about parenting is that we talk about the things that we should be doing as parents. So we talk about strategies or tips or techniques, and it's often very much focused on, the actions that we are taking and these kind of results that we should then be seeing in our children. What I find tricky about that is that it can leave our children as our kind of successful outcome. So if they're not then doing the kind of things that we feel like they should be doing, we can end up feeling either that there's something wrong with them or that there's something wrong with us. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, part of the reason that I wanted to write the book is that when we kind of understand ourselves and what gets brought up for us in those moments with our children, it's what gets brought up for us that is the reason why we'll then turn to advice or strategies or tips, because it leaves us feeling more in control or more like we know what we're doing. Actually, if we kind of look the other way, if we look within and we think about why is it that that's stirring up something so powerful in me, then we can think about how we want to respond to our child based just on who they are and what they might need from us in those moments. And it also means that we can give ourselves what we might need in those moments, which isn't always tips or tricks. It's more often compassion, soothing, some understanding about what that might have raised about our own experiences too.
Sure. So what you're talking about is the kind of the lasting impact of our own childhoods.
Yes, our childhoods, our experiences, our adult experiences too, the kind of relationships that we're in. This is the context that we exist in as parents. We are not just parents kind of parenting in a vacuum. We're really influenced by what's going on around us as well as our own histories.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some psychological thought that suggests that without a bit of work on ourselves, we might be slightly doomed to repeat patterns, pass them down through the
Mhm.
generations. What do you think of that?
I mean, I wouldn't use the word doomed. I think that there is an inevitability to the fact that we learn behavior and we learn behavior through our relationships with other people. We know what is acceptable or unacceptable through how we are responded to by those around us, both now and in our past. We come into the world as we are. There are we have our personality, our temperament, but it is the world around us that will shape how we express ourselves and how comfortable we feel in ourselves within that world. I think that we will always repeat some things from our past, even the things that we really don't want to repeat, because that's just part of being a human. We do repeat behaviors very automatically, sometimes things that we promised ourselves that we wouldn't do. At the same time, we might also repeat things that we really loved and that we cherished and that made us feel really cared for and loved and heard and understood. So, we can also replicate things that feel really meaningful and really positive for us. And there's something about our awareness or curiosity, even of why we do the things that we do, that can become so helpful when we're parents, when all of a sudden, that kind of relationship can feel like so important to us because it can feel like so much is at stake. So if we're finding that we are repeating things or that we're acting in ways that don't really fit with what we want to be doing, that's when it can be really helpful to just pause and think about what is being stirred up for us. And that doesn't have to be in therapy. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I find therapy incredibly helpful resource, but it can also be through talking to other people, people that you trust, finding parenting communities of people where you'll get kind of support and solidarity rather than just advice. I think that in itself can just help us grow our awareness of why we're doing the things that we're doing or why we're feeling the way that we're feeling.
And what might be a barrier to that kind of curiosity and self-reflection? What do you think?
So many barriers. Time. I mean, when we're parents, we don't have a lot of time, and I think that you know, doing that kind of reflective, self-reflective work, it takes time and it takes effort and it can be painful. So, you know, we need to have space and time around in order to be able to, you know, think through and reflect on what might be getting brought up for us. And that can be really difficult to do when we're parents. It's also a really great time to do that kind of reflection because so much is being stirred up for us. So in some ways our defenses are down a bit, especially in early parenthood. You know, these things can feel much more raw and much more present. So in some ways, even though it's hard to get the space, you can actually do that work very quickly because it's all kind of right there.
Mm.
Also access, you know, here in England, it can be very hard to access good mental health support, particularly longer term mental health support. Although if you're a new parent, you should have access to perinatal mental health support kind of more quickly. But even so, kind of after the first year or two, it can feel difficult to find somebody if you're going to go down that kind of therapeutic route, somebody who you feel is going to be there, you know, week in, week out. And I think in parenting, it can be really helpful to have longer term therapeutic support, but that's something that is really hard to access for a lot of people. And then stigma, you know, and I think, you know, I used that word before, that it can be very painful. It can be painful because we don't like looking at painful emotions. Of course, we don't. It hurts. So we often do work very hard to try not to do that. But also, we can be really worried about being judged, you know, by other people if we show that we're struggling or that we have things that we want to talk about. But we might also be really worried about being judged by healthcare professionals too. And that is an experience that lots of parents sadly do have. So there are lots of barriers and obstacles for people being able to even approach healthcare professionals. And that is different for different people. So we know that those from marginalized groups often find it much harder to receive the sort of, you know, high quality care that they might need for various different reasons.
Mm. That's a really good point, a really important point. And yeah, well, it makes me feel sad, this idea that the sense of failure and wanting to keep that private into yourself might stop you from going out and getting help.
Well, it's for so many different reasons, right? One of them is just the absolute pragmatic reality that it can be really hard to get a GP appointment. It can be really hard then, if you do get a GP appointment, to feel that you have the space and time to be able to share something that can feel very painful. And when you're feeling sensitive and vulnerable, as you always are in early parenthood, not wanting to kind of impose something that feels really difficult for you onto somebody else can really, you know, can kind of cause problems. But also, what we know from recent research is that actually, even when people are brave enough to go and seek support, you know, the stats show that lots of those people still are not then passed on to services because either those services are hard to access or referral routes feel really complicated. So, you know, we know that about half of women with postnatal depression, for example, won't speak to a professional about their experience of depression. That's a really high number. And that's a number from about 5 years ago. So I imagine that's probably increased with the impact of COVID and lockdowns. But then also, we do have this social story, this narrative that we have in our culture that parents should cope, that parenting is something that comes naturally to people. So we can have this feeling, this very strong internalized message that if I'm not coping, if I don't feel okay about, you know, just my parenting or my daily life, then it's something that I'm doing wrong. And that in itself can create such a barrier to seeking help because it can feel this like a sense of failure rather than actually just this is really hard and I need some support to be able to make it feel easier.
Yeah. I mean, on that note of the social stories, there's some really interesting things in your book around heterosexual couples and same-sex couples, and just the impact of cultural forces as well. And could you tell us a bit more about this, about the point you make about the kind of the traditional gender norms that have been absorbed maybe more by heterosexual couples, clashing with modern expectations of events.
Of parenting. There's actually some really great research that's been done on this by a researcher from King's College. She talks about how our kind of modern relationship goals really clash with our modern parenting goals. So if our relationship goals are often around equity, equality, shared goals and partnership, actually lots of more modern parenting goals are around attachment parenting, gentle parenting, quite intensive parenting approaches, and often they can clash. So where you might have had something that looked much more gender equal before parenting, all of a sudden the kind of attitudes or goals that you might have as a partnership change. So there might be one partner, most commonly the woman, who feels that as part of this kind of new identity, she needs to be thoroughly absorbed in her child. There's lots of stories that really promote that message. And then what happens to, if we're talking about heteronormative relationships, a man who is then kind of wondering about what his role is. And then so much in that about what are our kind of cultural stories about fatherhood, about motherhood. What do we see when we're watching TV or films or reading books around how relationships operate after you have a baby? Often these aren't really stories that we talk about, the kind of really messy bits that happen at 4 o'clock in the morning when everybody's in tears. There is no kind of story around how do we cope with that. So couples, have to kind of grapple with this. And often they can come up against lots of conflicting internalized messages about what they're supposed to be doing as a mum or as a dad. And I mean, Eve Rodsky talks about this in her book Fair Play as well, this idea of almost kind of accidentally falling into a more traditional parenting relationship or dynamic. And that can breed a lot of resentment, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of conflict. And that can feel very, very difficult to resolve, as a couple. I think I often find it really helpful to widen out that lens and kind of look at it as actually something that's so present in our culture at the moment. This is something that I hear about from a lot of families in the village parenting community that I run. It's a topic that comes up a lot. This idea of how do we resolve what is at the moment a kind of social problem of how we exist as an equal couple in a society that makes it really hard to parent equally. In same-sex or non-gender conforming families, what often happens, because there aren't those strong stories of traditional parenting, often in couples where they're having to write their own story of how we're going to bring a baby into the world, who's going to be the one who stays at home, how do we want to, think about kind of household labor, economic productivity, all of that stuff, because there isn't such a powerful model there already. Actually, couples have to think together from the very beginning, how are we actually going to do this together? So in that way, conflict, although of course conflict can still be there, it's not so driven by these very powerful kind of cultural norms that can be there in heterosexual or heteronormative relationships.
So there's something about doing the kind of work up front, having a conscious beginning kind of might help things down the line.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's something I read a stat from, there's a somatic couples counsellor called Jordan Dunn. She talked about, the amount of couples who are in a kind of conscious coupling relationship where it's something like 5% of couples are actually in a relationship where they're really consciously talking about, and this is not just parents, right? This is couples overall, are in a relationship where they're talking very openly and curiously about what are we bringing to this relationship? How do we want this relationship to be? So much unconscious stuff comes into play. And when we're busy and we're tired and we're stressed, it's so difficult to figure out the ways that we're going to resolve that. But it's so important to do that, because otherwise it does come out in conflict or misunderstanding. And of course, that gets acted out through our children as well. That's where family dynamics can get really complex.
Makes sense. It feels important maybe to mention childhood trauma and the lasting impact that can have. And you speak a bit about how it might be outside of conscious awareness and showing up in the body and physical symptoms. Can you just say more about that?
Well, I think trauma can feel like such a big word. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that even when I started writing the book proposal a number of years ago, the idea of talking about trauma was something that I often felt like I had to caveat. It was this kind of idea of, I know this can feel like a really big word, but this is what trauma does to us. And actually, because of TikTok and Instagram and social media conversations, trauma is something that is so much more widely talked about, which is great, because actually so many people have an experience of trauma in their history. It could be from their childhood, it could be from pre-becoming a parent, that will impact on them in their parenting journey. When I think about trauma, I think of it just like a wound. It can be like a psychological wound. And we can have a big wound, like a really big acute incident that might have happened. Like it could be, a car accident, or that if we're talking about it from psychological terms, it could be emotional abuse or something that from the outside kind of very clearly looks like a traumatic incident or event.
Wow.
What most people experience is something that can feel much more, kind of little wounds or little injuries that just continue to happen over a prolonged period of time, that can leave us feeling guarded, like we need to protect ourselves in some way. Those are the kind of things that allow us. I mean, it happens to all of us in different ways. We then develop ways to protect ourselves, kind of defenses against being wounded again. So the ways that we protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable, or the ways that we protect ourselves from being hurt, that happens to all of us in our relationships. But when we've had repeated experiences of trauma in our childhood or at other times in our life, we will inevitably be more protective of ourselves. It raises our stress in our body. It leaves us feeling anxious. It leaves us feeling more kind of alert or hyper aware of other incidents of harm that might come our way. So we might enter into our parenting, for example, just feeling quite vigilant, feeling that we have to be careful. Where it becomes really important to think about in parenting is how we then replicate that with our child. So either we might, be assuming that our child is going to be at risk of harm because of our own experiences, and we might then be very protective of them, trying to prevent them from having further harm. Or we might go the other way, right? We might kind of try and avoid any idea that harm might befall our child, and that can leave us feeling quite cut off and disconnected. And where it can be really important to think about how trauma is showing up in our system is just thinking about how it can be impacting on the way that we are interacting with our child. So we can almost see them through our own lens. But when we look at our experience and think about what's ours, what belongs to us, and what might belong to them, it can help us think more clearly about what they need. And in order to do that, we need to start with thinking about what we need, either what we need now or maybe what we needed back then.
That feels really important. Yeah.
Just as we're starting to talk about trauma, I've got a dog that starts whining in the background. I'm sorry.
Okay, I can't hear it.
Okay.
And for people who might have an experience closer to that, and they've become parents, and maybe they're surprised by how off kilter they feel, what would you kind of recommend for them?
I think if the word trauma does resonate with you, it is important to seek help from a professional. There are ways that we can look at traumatic events on our own, but particularly when we've had traumatic experiences in our relationships, the most effective way to heal that trauma is through our relationships. So being able to have an ongoing therapeutic relationship with somebody who you can feel really safe with and comfortable with, and is also able to challenge some of the assumptions that you might make based on that experience. That is how we can really resolve that feeling of trauma that we carry in our bodies, in our systems. We need to feel safe in relationships in order to be able to pass that feeling of safety on to other people. And that can happen in our other relationships. But I think when you're working so hard as a parent, having somebody who is dedicated, who is there for you, can feel like a really meaningful way of helping you, support you through understanding your own traumatic experiences and what's that left you with.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's great.
You're so welcome.
Best of luck with the book. It's great.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Oh,
fabulous. Thank you so much. Been great talking to you.
Thank you, Emma. You too. Take care.
Take care.